My CEO husband fired me because of his mistress, but my secret code destroyed his $8 million empire. 4 years, I dedicated my life to building a company born from the union of love and entrepreneurial vision. I believed we were creating something grand professionally and as a couple. But when I was called into an unexpected meeting, I realized that story was no longer about partnership. It was about betrayal. I was fired from the company I helped found, coldly, under false accusations, with his mistress by his side. Instead of screaming or pleading, I chose silence. Because 6 months prior, I had already foreseen that moment would come. And with it came the activation of a carefully prepared sequence. What began as pain transformed into strategy. What seemed like defeat was merely the first step toward my liberation. This isn't just a story about technology and power. It's about emotional intelligence, silent justice, and the strength of a woman no one could extinguish. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story to the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my truth has reached. The notification arrived late in the afternoon, dry without context. Urgent meeting, read the subject line, sent directly from Peter's email. In that instant, a shiver ran down my spine, as if something inside me already knew the ground was about to give way. Still, I maintained my composure, got up from my chair, and walked down the hallway as if it were just another mundane appointment. I was a co-founder of that company. Impossible to imagine anything could surprise me. I arrived at the room, and the door was already ajar, as if they were waiting for me with a certain impatience. The silence inside was dense, almost rehearsed. Peter was seated at the head of the table, with a discreet smile, and Vanessa beside him, organizing papers. No other team members were present, and the atmosphere, usually collaborative, felt hostile. My intuition pulsed at maximum alert, but my face maintained the neutrality years of leadership had taught me to sustain. Peter greeted me formally, as if we were strangers, as if we hadn't shared code, coffee, and sleepless nights. Vanessa cast a brief, calculated glance, without any trace of empathy. He began to speak mechanically, citing words like strategic alignment and restructuring necessity. I listened, but it was as if I were somewhere else observing everything from outside. Something was very wrong, and I was the central target of that charade. There was no doubt. This meeting was a trap disguised as corporate formality. Peter didn't seem nervous, and Vanessa had a slight smile at the corner of her mouth, like someone inwardly celebrating. There was a certainty in both their expressions that deeply bothered me. I still didn't know the content of the attack, but I perfectly understood that it was about to begin. Peter had a strange smile, as if he already knew the end of that chapter. The words left Peter's mouth with technical coldness, as if he were reading a pre-approved report. "We have decided to terminate your involvement with the company," he said, with Vanessa handing me a letterhead document. I barely heard the legal terms because what truly hurt was seeing my name there, disconnected from the history I myself helped build. The betrayal was signed in every line of that paper. It wasn't just dismissal. It was an emptying of identity. Vanessa remained silent, but her presence was eloquent. She occupied the space of co-author of the coup, wearing the guise of a new partner, a new brilliant mind, a carefully constructed lie. Peter spoke defensively, as if he wanted to protect himself even before any reaction. They accused me of inconsistent conduct and unilateral decisions, vague words molded to justify the unjustifiable. It was obvious that everything had been premeditated by them. I didn't ask for explanations. I didn't beg. I didn't react. I just read the document carefully, not for its content, which was already decided, but for the legal traces that might be useful later. The silence I maintained was more powerful than any protest. Vanessa seemed uncomfortable for a second, as if expecting screams or tears. Peter, in turn, maintained the theatrical tone of someone who believes they are acting on behalf of the company. I carefully put the paper away without tearing it, without crumpling it. It was now part of something bigger, something they still didn't understand. The tremor that ran through my fingers wasn't fear. It was anticipation. I was being pushed out, but I had prepared for that push. The paper with my dismissal trembled, but it wasn't my hand that was shaking. I slowly stood up, looked around like someone observing a stage before turning off the lights. The room where so many dreams had been forged was now a scene of betrayal. No apologies, no remorseful glances. Just silence and conviction. Peter didn't even follow me with his eyes, as if my presence had been deleted from his system. Vanessa, immobile, just watched like someone marking the end of a game already won. I walked through the central corridors with firm steps, feeling the curious glances of the few employees who crossed my path. No one knew what had happened inside, but the atmosphere already hinted at something out of the ordinary. I took a deep breath, maintaining my leadership posture until the last second. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me crumble, because it wasn't an end. It was a silent turning point that only I understood at that moment. Passing my old office, I didn't go in. I didn't need to. I had already removed all important files weeks before. A silent instinct had warned me about what was coming. My backups were safe, encrypted, untouchable. That company still used what I had built, but the heart of the system was already beating elsewhere. Place all my own. And that's what sustained me at that instant. I left the building without looking back, like someone closing a cycle with the certainty that the next has already begun. I didn't need an audience to know the extent of my strength. They won a battle, but they completely ignored the kind of war they had provoked. But they didn't know they had pulled the first trigger. It all started with an idea in the cramped living room of a modest apartment. Peter and I, with 2 old laptops and dreams bigger than the space allowed. There were no investors, no structured business plan, just passion and conviction. We worked nights on end fixing bugs, designing architectures, and dreaming the impossible. With every line of code, the feeling that we were creating something eternal. Peter was enthusiastic, visionary, and believed in our project with a sparkle in his eyes. Or at least that's what he showed. We shared more than responsibilities. There was complicity, affection, a rare intimacy in corporate environments. He made me feel secure, as if we were an invincible duo. There was a raw beauty in it all, as if the real world hadn't quite reached us yet, until success arrived. I remember the day we closed our first big contract. He opened a bottle of cheap sparkling wine, but the sparkle in his eyes was worth millions. Everything will always be ours, he said, hugging me tightly, as if it were a promise sealed in source code. At that moment I believed him. I gave him my trust, my energy, my intelligence. And most importantly, I gave him my naivete. The company was our child, our invention, and it shaped us every step of the way. I believed nothing could destroy us, that the foundation was too solid. But the seed of destruction had already been planted, and I didn't see it. Because I believed more in his promise than in my own intuition. His promise still echoed. Everything will always be ours. With growth came fame, events, invitations to panels and investment rounds. We began to circulate among big names in the sector, and the pressure increased. It was in this scenario that Vanessa appeared, elegant, articulate, with an impeccable resume and irreproachable recommendations. Peter seemed enchanted by her presence from the beginning, although he tried to hide it. She was introduced as a strategic consultant. In the first few months, Vanessa remained discreet. I even tried to like her. But over time, I noticed small movements, as if she was slowly occupying spaces that were once mine. Her suggestions turned into decisions without debate. Peter began to vehemently defend her in meetings, even when her ideas were shallow. I started to question mentally, but still thought it was just professional jealousy. The problem wasn't her competence. It was the way her presence altered the balance. And I ignored the signs. The frequent lunches with Peter, the meetings I wasn't included in, the knowing laughs in the hallway. All of this was visible, but I refused to interpret it. When you blindly believe in someone, your brain prefers to ignore the red flags. Today I see clearly what was once just a fog. Vanessa didn't come by chance. She was chosen, cultivated, and positioned. And while I was building, she was watching, waiting for the right moment to make her move. She arrived smiling, and I didn't even notice the warning sign. Gradually, I realized my ideas were being diluted. Meetings I led were now being run by others. Documents were rewritten without my review. I started to feel invisible within my own creation. That's when I decided to document everything. Every project, every feature, every algorithm that bore my signature. I created a hidden repository, accessible only to me, protected by multi-layer encryption. It was a technical diary but also an emotional one. Each commit was a silent cry of identity. There, I recorded dates, changes, decisions with proof of authorship. It started as an impulse for self-protection, but soon it became a necessity. Peter and Vanessa never noticed. They trusted too much in my apparent passivity, and that was their mistake. Because while they were erasing me publicly, I was silently registering myself in all systems. My code wasn't just technical. It was testimony. It was resistance. When they finally removed me, what they wouldn't know was that the digital heart of the company still belonged to me. Every line of code was now a silent signature. At first, there were subtle interruptions. I would start presenting a project, and suddenly Peter would take over, as if complimenting me. But soon this became a habit. I was only called to fill a seat, while he guided the narrative. At each new meeting, I felt my relevance diminishing, being erased in real time before others. My points were ignored, and decisions were driven by him as if I didn't exist. I started to observe the pattern. When I raised a suggestion, he would dismiss it with generic terms like, "We'll evaluate that later." But when someone else repeated the same idea in different words, he would immediately accept it. I realized it wasn't accidental. It was an attempt to undermine me, to silence me from within. And the cruelest part was the naturalness with which he did it, as if he were merely following a protocol of exclusion. In internal meetings with the development team, he began to assume the role that had always been mine, the technical lead. He spoke with authority about decisions he had never discussed with me, and took credit for solutions that came directly from my mind. I was being rewritten in real time. And worse, no one seemed to notice. Or if they did, they preferred the comfortable silence of hierarchy. Even in the face of this, I continued to attend meetings. My presence intact, my posture firm. Because my silence was not surrender. It was storage. Every humiliation was recorded. Every word, stored in my memory. He began to speak for me, as if my voice were a detail. A technical report on recent vulnerabilities was sent for external analysis. The content was mine. Every line, every recommendation. But the credit printed at the top of the file was Vanessa's. I looked at that signature and for a second thought it was a mistake. But it wasn't. It was theft disguised as internal reorganization. The feeling was of having been ripped from myself. I sought Peter, questioned him calmly, almost as a request for clarification. He responded with indifference, saying that Vanessa merely compiled the information. It was a lie. That material had been delivered by me, with handwritten notes, revised 3 times before being finalized. But now, publicly, it wasn't mine. I was shadow. She was light. Vanessa passed by me with neutral smiles, as if she didn't know what she had done. But she knew. She knew exactly what she was taking from me. Her elegance was a well-trained disguise, and her skill was in subtly appropriating things. I began to realize that this wasn't isolated. Several internal documents were already being edited to minimize my presence. Little by little, I realized I could no longer trust any official instance. I started saving copies, screenshots, emails. Nothing would be left to chance anymore. Because if they were rewriting history, I would write my version with evidence. She smiled, but I saw the hidden blade in the sparkle of her eyes. I returned to the core of the main platform source code, reviewing blocks and functions with the care of someone who knows every inch of their own skin. I began to implement subtle lines, invisible to any inattentive developer. They were shortcuts, detours, hidden commands, entry points concealed beneath trivial functions, created with the precision of someone who knew what they were doing and why. These doors would not only allow remote access, they would give me control. Control over logs, files, audit logs, movement reports. It was like planting invisible sensors that would inform me, in the future, of everything that happened within the system. I programmed calmly, always after hours, in commits that went unnoticed by the auditor's eyes. Invisibility became my greatest weapon. It wasn't just defense. It was also a counterattack. I knew I was slowly being erased from the official narrative, but no one could erase what they didn't know. While they discredited me, I built alternative routes to the truth. Nothing I did was motivated by anger. It was intelligence applied to survival, strategic silence, emotional programming. I stored everything on servers they would never be able to trace. What I was building was no longer just code. It was the record of my authorship, of my resistance, and above all, of my preparation. One day, this system would serve me better than ever. Tina was always observant. While many hid behind diplomacy, she kept her eyes on the details. I noticed her approach after a meeting where I was completely ignored. She followed me discreetly to the hallway and commented, almost in a whisper, that she noticed the changes. She said something was out of place, and that I didn't deserve to be treated that way. That was the first spark of relief in a long time. We weren't close friends, but she always showed respect for my technical decisions. In the following days, she started pulling small conversations, almost imperceptible to others. I realized she was also observing Peter and Vanessa more closely. Gradually, our shared silence turned into an implicit alliance. An invisible network began to form. Tina never acted impulsively. When she finally decided to open up to me, she chose a strategic moment. She waited for the elevator to empty and handed me a folded note. It was direct and to the point. "We need to talk, just us two." At that moment, I knew something deeper was happening. She knew more than she let on. I took a deep breath and put the paper in my pocket, feeling the weight of what was to come. I was no longer alone in that minefield. And perhaps Tina was more than an observer. Perhaps she was the witness I didn't even know I needed. Her message said, "We need to talk, just us two." We arranged to meet at a cafe far from the company. She arrived early, sitting in the most isolated corner, her eyes watchful. There was no nervousness in her expression, but there was urgency. When I approached, she didn't smile. She just pulled out her bag and placed a small USB stick on the table. "There's something here you need to hear," she said, her voice firm. She explained that weeks earlier, she was working late and overheard Peter and Vanessa in an adjacent room. She recognized the conspiratorial tone and on impulse, decided to record them. The audio contained not only proof of professional betrayal, but clear phrases about the plan to remove me. These were calculated, cold conversations about my progressive removal and the new image they wanted to build for the company. I remained silent, listening to everything with a racing heart. Every sentence was like a precisely aimed stab. But Tina didn't avert her gaze. She knew the weight of what she had done and was willing to go all the way. "I couldn't pretend I wasn't seeing it anymore," she said. I just nodded, unable to thank her. Because that recording was more than evidence. It was the truth confirming what I felt. I kept the USB stick as if it were a rare jewel. It was a key, perhaps the most important one yet. Tina had crossed a line of loyalty, and I knew the risk she was taking. The recordings are safe and only you can use them. I arrived home that night and locked all the doors. I turned off the lights, disconnected the Wi-Fi, and plugged the USB stick into an isolated laptop. I emotionally prepared myself to listen to everything. And still, nothing could have shielded me from what I heard. Peter and Vanessa laughed, mocked, discussed deadlines and strategies as if talking about logistics, not about destroying a person. And that person was me. The first recording was short but impactful. Peter said I was too emotional, and that it was time to modernize leadership. Vanessa responded with suggestions on how to discredit my technical decisions. In another track, they discussed how to change contracts and documents to hide my authorship. That wasn't just ambition. It was cruelty packaged in corporate pragmatism. I paused multiple times. I closed my eyes. I breathed. But I pressed play again. I needed to hear it all. I needed to know how far they were willing to go to erase me. The recordings left no room for doubt. This was a plan. Project. And now, with that evidence, I had what they feared most: control. When the last recording ended, I remained silent for long minutes. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just felt my old world crumble completely. Every word was a nail in the coffin of the image I had of him. I began reviewing administrative access during the night, when no one was monitoring internal traffic. A specific movement caught my attention. Frequent transfers to supplier accounts never before registered. The amounts were high and recurring, always close to investor meeting dates. I opened the tax reports and found glaring discrepancies between what was declared and what actually left the accounts. This was not an error. It was a cover-up. Most entries came with vague justifications: external consulting, system adjustment, contractual review. Generic words to hide specific purposes. I started cross-referencing information with names and dates, And the more I investigated, the more patterns emerged. It was as if someone was testing the limits of fiscal invisibility. And I, who programmed the security system, knew exactly where to look. As the numbers aligned in parallel spreadsheets, my unease turned into conviction. These discrepancies were not just financial, they were structural. They were undermining the company's foundation from within, siphoning resources while presenting prosperity to shareholders. It was ironic. Peter had accused me of inconsistent conduct, and in the end, he was the very definition of it. I no longer needed technical proof. Now I had documented truth. I sat with the printed reports before me and marked the points of greatest inconsistency. I smiled, not with satisfaction but with anticipation. They were falling into the trap they believed they controlled. The reports didn't match. And that's exactly what I expected. I decided to investigate the recipients of the suspicious transfers further. In one of the spreadsheets, I found a company identification number that appeared frequently. I researched and discovered that the company was registered under the name of Marcos Morales, Vanessa's brother. It was a shell company, opened less than a year ago, with no declared employees, no history of services provided. Everything about it screamed irregularity. I continued cross-referencing data with other names from her family, and the pattern repeated. Companies registered in small towns with low social capital, but receiving hefty sums from our main account. It was a well-orchestrated scheme, discreet, but vulnerable to the slightest trained eye. And who better to dismantle it than the one who programmed the original data matrix? Peter would never have noticed. He trusted Vanessa too much, or perhaps pretended not to see. But now, with the links exposed, I had more than suspicion, I had proof. I decided to save everything. Screenshots, transfer records, business registrations. Every element was now part of my silent survival file. They thought they were untouchable, but I already saw the crack. I knew Vanessa well enough to know she played coldly. But that family tie left a weak spot exposed. And that's where I would begin to apply pressure. Her brother's name appeared more than once. With the data in hand, I began the duplication process. First, a physical backup, encrypted in 3 layers, stored on a hard drive with no network access. Then, most importantly, external servers outside the company's jurisdiction. I chose secure platforms with IP masking and distributed the information in isolated compartments. Nothing was in one place. Nothing would be easy to trace. I divided the files into 3 main folders: financial, source code, and parallel evidence. Within each, documents, prints, recordings, and access logs. It was like assembling a puzzle whose final design only I knew. Every detail was carefully named, as if I were leaving traces only for myself. If they tried to tamper, it would trigger real-time alerts. This process gave me back the control Peter had tried to take. With each file saved, it was as if I reclaimed a part of myself that had been erased. It was no longer about proving something to others, but about ensuring that, at the right moment, no one could deny what I knew. The truth was protected. And so was I. They still walked calmly through the corridors, believing in their own narrative of power. Little did they know that their security was now an illusion. Their security now depended on my benevolence. It wasn't long before the whispers began. A colleague from HR looked at me with pity during coffee, as if she knew something I didn't yet. At the end of the day, Tina confirmed, Peter was saying I was emotionally unstable. He said my decisions were being influenced by personal matters, and that I needed rest. It was a well-rehearsed script, the same one used by so many men in positions of power. The accusation wasn't direct, but planted in small conversations in hallways, at dinners with investors. The strategy was to discredit me even before I reacted. And it worked, at least superficially. Some began to treat me with subtle caution, as if I would break at any moment. Invisibility now came disguised as false concern. It hurt more than any other attack. Because it's not just about defamation. It's about stealing another's sanity in the eyes of the world. Peter knew exactly what he was doing. By painting me as unbalanced, he delegitimized any reaction from me. It was the perfect move for a manipulator. Cause the damage and then declare himself the protector. But I would not respond in kind. I would not give him the spectacle he expected. I wrote down the names of those who repeated the lines, the times, the environments, Silence once again would be my strategic response. "She's losing it," he whispered. I sought out Dr. Reeves on a Tuesday morning without an appointment. He saw me promptly, as if he had been expecting me. I said little but enough. I told him about the rumors, about the meetings, about how they were silently erasing me. He listened with absolute attention, his fingers laced under his chin, his eyes fixed on mine. When I finished, he sighed. "This is classic gaslighting," he said without mincing words. "You're not crazy, Allison. They are distorting your reality until you yourself doubt it." Those words made me tremble inside. It wasn't just a feeling. It was a method, a subtle and profoundly cruel form of control. Hearing that from an outsider, I understood the gravity of what I was facing. He explained how these strategies erode self-esteem and make us apologize for mistakes we didn't commit. He spoke about the cycle of doubt, invalidation, and the need for constant reaffirmation. I knew these patterns in theory, but living them is another universe. I left his office with a clearer mind. The pain remained, but now it had a name. I would no longer react emotionally. I would transform everything into analysis, into a calculated response. If they called me unstable, I would show my coldness. This is classic gaslighting, and you're not crazy. After that consultation, my behavior changed completely. I started smiling more, but with watchful eyes. I responded to emails with impeccable cordiality, but without yielding an inch. My statements in meetings became short, direct, technical again, impossible to manipulate. I took on the role they expected of me, but with a hidden layer of strategy beneath. It was programmed invisibility. I went back to wearing more neutral clothes, avoided open conflicts, and assumed the role of someone who accepts the changes. I let Peter believe his plans were working, because what he didn't see was that my architecture was no longer emotional. It was digital, legal, and silent. My war wouldn't be fought with shouts but with data. Tina noticed the change. She didn't ask anything, but our eyes met during a meeting, and she nodded slightly. She knew I had crossed a new frontier. From that point on, there was no more room for hesitation. I was an observer, a player, and the programmer of my own exit. Except it wasn't an escape. It was a strategic return. They still thought they were in control, and that was the best part. Because no one protects themselves from what they believe they have defeated. I would show no more cracks. Not to them. I returned to the core of the system with surgical eyes. Every line of code was now reviewed, not with the intention of fixing flaws, but of inserting them on purpose. I created subtle vulnerabilities disguised as legitimate functions, which could only be accessed by me. It was like drawing secret tunnels beneath the foundations of a castle that still appeared intact from the outside. No one would suspect because no one knew the code as well as I did. I incorporated hidden parameters, masked keywords, and commands activatable by specific usage patterns. These flaws wouldn't bring down the system immediately, but they would make it unstable and vulnerable under certain conditions. I knew that sooner or later I would have to use them. And when that day came, everything would crumble from the inside out without a sound. The beauty of silent destruction is that it looks a lot like a technical failure. I worked alternating hours, connecting through masked IPs, using different machines for each session. Every modification was recorded in logs that only I had access to, and which could be erased with a simple command line. It was a work of patience and precision. I knew that, if done in haste, any failure of mine could be discovered. But I had time. And now I had enough motivation not to make mistakes. This was my way of marking territory, of creating a map where only I knew the hidden paths. It was no longer just code, it was the encrypted language of survival. It was like designing a castle with entrances only I knew. I knew that, beyond technical engineering, I needed to protect my legal rights. Tina, with her administrative precision, was essential in this stage. We gathered all records from the company's early days, and she helped me build a complete dossier. Emails, commit dates, authorship history, development environment screenshots. Each item validated my contribution as a founder and creator of the system. We hired a discreet legal consultancy specializing in intellectual property. In less than 2 weeks, all my work was officially documented in a notary office, with digital recognition. The company could try to erase me from the public narrative, but legally I was embedded in the origins. It was more than protection. It was a reconstruction of my professional identity. Peter never worried about this. He thought that, by being in leadership and signing contracts, all the merit was his. But he never understood that ideas don't come with stamps. They come with logic, effort, and vision. And that no one could retroactively erase. My name's signature was now also printed outside the system, in documents that would stand the test of time. When the process was finalized, I felt a silent wave of justice. Not relief, but certainty. If they ever tried to legally confront me, they would be stepping into a legal minefield. Now, my name was officially where it always should be. With the system already modified and the legal documents in hand, only one last step remained: preparing the trigger. The contingency trigger was programmed into a separate module, masked as a maintenance routine. It worked like an invisible button that, when activated, would generate a sequence of cascading failures. Each interconnected function would collapse in a controlled manner, creating a calculated, irreversible chaos. I configured multiple activation methods, by time, by external command, and even by attempted access blocking. It didn't matter how they tried to stop me, the system would react. It was my last line of defense, but also my most precise weapon. I no longer needed to be inside the company to disarm it. Just a click, a signal, a silent code. I tested everything 10 times, then 5 more. It was essential to ensure there were no errors. Each function responded as expected, without raising alerts in the security systems. The development team would never notice, because it didn't follow any known threat pattern. It was a code that only responded to me like a digital signature of destiny. When I finished, I slowly closed the laptop. That small gesture carried months of pain, coldness, and preparation. The invisible war was armed, and the first battle was already won. A command, time, and nothing would ever be the same. The notification arrived by email with a neutral title: Process Initiation, Legal Guidance. I opened the attachment and saw the inevitable. Peter had filed for divorce. The document was direct, procedural, and already made it clear that he had no intention of dividing the company. The tone was cold, as if I were just a name on a list of legal pending matters. There it was, the final attempt to erase me even as a wife. I remained silent for long minutes, watching the cursor blink at the top of the screen. There was no surprise. In fact, there was even a strange sense of relief. Now everything was laid bare. What was once camouflaged betrayal was now an official sentence. I was no longer a partner, no longer a companion. I was nothing to him anymore. But I knew exactly what I was to myself: a survivor. This was not a defeat. It was a turning point. Peter believed he was closing the door with legal elegance. Little did he know that door didn't lead to an end. It led to the trigger. The separation, finally, was the last seal of his own ruin. I didn't cry. I didn't write back. I just forwarded the email to my lawyer and saved a copy in my secret files. They wanted to officially erase me. 3 days later, a notice was sent to the entire team. Executive Transition Meeting. That was the name of the event scheduled by Peter. He would present his new management plan, formalizing Vanessa's definitive entry as interim CEO. They disguised as protocol what was clearly a symbolic execution. The meeting room was prepared like a ceremony, but I already knew. This was a theatrical farewell. I received the invitation like the others without distinction. There was no mention of my presence as a founder or former partner, just another name on the list. That's how Peter wanted to treat me now, as part of the past he could delete with a click. Vanessa, of course, would be the star of the news cycle, and he the visionary who knew when to withdraw. His every move was carefully rehearsed to appear elegant, mature, professional. But what I saw was a man desperately needing to seem in control. He didn't know that true control was no longer his. The meeting would be the stage for his illusion, and I would be the only one there who knew the ending of the play. I confirmed my attendance with a simple okay in the reply. I would be punctual. I would be impeccable. And I would be lethal, albeit in silence. He said it was just protocol, but I knew it was execution. I chose a minimalist black dress, my hair precisely pinned up, and a subtle perfume. My appearance was that of someone accepting the end with elegance. I arrived 5 minutes early, sat on the side, and observed in silence. The room was full, everyone curious about the change. Peter entered with a victorious posture, followed by Vanessa, smiling and confident. He began to speak with enthusiasm, like someone presenting a new era. He didn't look at me directly until the end of the presentation. When he finally did, it was merely out of formality. "We thank everyone who has been a part of this journey so far." I smiled back with the serenity of someone holding a valuable secret. Vanessa signed the documents before everyone, receiving lukewarm applause. I clapped too, not out of support but out of closure. I asked no questions. I offered no resistance. I let them believe they had broken me. It was necessary. Every disdainful look, every perfunctory gesture, fueled my certainty. They were sealing a destiny they thought was sovereign. But it was no longer theirs. It was mine. And it wouldn't be long before they found out. I was the last to leave the room with firm steps and an unshakable gaze. What was coming next no longer depended on anyone's permission. In Peter's eyes there was victory. In mine only a countdown. The morning after the meeting I received a brief notice. I would have 1 hour to collect my belongings. 2 security guards awaited me at the reception, wearing that kind of uncomfortable neutrality. I walked beside them in silence, feeling each step as part of a ritual that was not my own. The company was silent, almost complicit. No words were spoken during the walk to my old office. The door was already unlocked. My things organized in cardboard boxes as if everything could be packed away so easily. Papers, books, small items of emotional value. There were 3 years of history compressed. I touched each item carefully without attachment but with respect. Each of them carried the trace of a version of me that was now bidding farewell with dignity. The security guards showed no impatience. They merely observed me with forced politeness, perhaps expecting some reaction. But my response was silence. When I finished, I closed the last box and turned to them. "We can go." They nodded, clearing the way as if escorting me not out, but to something much greater. And they were right. As I walked through the central corridor, I lifted my chin and let my gaze sweep over each wall. I smiled at each of them as someone who knows a secret. Upon leaving the room, the walk to the exit seemed longer. Some employees looked up, others immediately looked away. The corridor was filled with glances that didn't know where to land. No one came to talk to me, but everyone knew what was happening. The silence said more than any formal farewell. There was guilt in the air, and perhaps fear too. A young man from finance, with whom I had shared dozens of meetings, caught my eye and quickly returned to his computer screen. An intern, whom I myself had recommended, bit her lip as if suppressing an apology. There was no more room for affection, nor for justifications. I was the uncomfortable presence of a truth everyone had chosen to ignore. Every step I took reinforced the image I had built, that of the woman they couldn't erase. My body was saying goodbye, but my mind was already operating in the invisible realm where true justice would unfold. And when everything collapsed, many would remember this day, my silence, my calm, my gaze. It was hard to know what weighed more, my absence or the shadow of what was yet to come. They didn't know whether to look at me with pity or fear. Outside, the driver was already waiting with the trunk open. I placed the boxes in the back seat and got into the car without saying a word. My cell phone in hand, the script loaded, the moment prepared. I took a deep breath, looked at the building one last time, and tapped the screen with surgical precision. The code executed. In less than 3 seconds, the system received the first signal. It was like pressing an invisible button and with it, breaking the axis of an empire. The car slowly pulled away, while the system began to run commands that none of them would be able to understand, much less prevent. I didn't smile. It wasn't about revenge but about justice. And that justice had no face. It had logic, numbers, algorithms, and it was irreversible. I knew that in the next few hours, chaos would spread like an impossible-to-contain crack. The code had been activated by time and context, designed to multiply without leaving a trace. And like any good weapon, it was silent, but its strength devastating. It was the end of their cycle, and the beginning of mine. The car's departure wasn't an escape. It was a coronation. I didn't need to be there to win. The tide had turned, and their empire was about to crumble. The first glitch was subtle. A graph that disappeared from the control panel. Then the financial sector's files began to show access errors. In less than 20 minutes, reports became unreadable. Analysts restarted systems in vain, while blue screens began to appear on random machines. Chaos set in without an apparent origin. It looked like a virus, but it was mathematical precision. The vulnerabilities created months earlier began to activate in sequence. The main database crashed on simple commands, and no backup was functional. A developer tried to revert one of the functions but was immediately blocked. Passwords became misconfigured on their own. Each team movement was an uncoordinated dance within an architecture that no longer obeyed them. Lights flickered in the central server. Internal alarms activated. But there was no one with enough knowledge to understand what was happening. Peter, in his office, yelled orders while trying to maintain his composure. Vanessa called suppliers, requesting urgent technical assistance. But no one could contain the advance of the failure. It wasn't an error, it was a programmed collapse. And all of this began with a silent, calculated command. The blue screens appeared like a programmed symphony. Peter frantically typed codes, trying to access restricted areas of the system. But each attempt failed. The root administrator had been deleted without warning, and secondary accesses were corrupted. He sweated, called old developers, cursed the keyboard, banged on the table. But the system, like a living entity, ignored him. He was no longer in control. And that terrified him. He tried to restore an earlier version, but the path was corrupted. With each new attempt, a short message appeared. Access denied. His eyes, once full of confidence, were now wide with disbelief. Each command was like another shovelful of dirt thrown onto his pride. That wasn't a technical failure. It was intelligence molded into code, and he knew it. Vanessa entered the room and found him completely distraught. He was trying to access external servers, but all backups were compromised. Digital contracts were disappearing from the internal legal system. Finances were paralyzed. And it all happened without him even being able to understand where he had gone wrong. Because the mistake, in fact, was believing that I wouldn't react. The more he struggled, the more the company's structure crumbled in his hands. Every attempt he made was one more step in the labyrinth I had built. Vanessa screamed, paced in circles, demanding answers Peter didn't have. The company's stock plummeted in real time. Investors started calling in succession, asking what had happened. Peter tried to explain but stumbled over his words. Vanessa, desperate, pointed at him as the culprit. "You let her get this far," she accused. The room turned into a civil war. He retorted, saying she had promised to fix everything, that she had everything under control. The two confronted each other with shouts and aggressive gestures, revealing to the few remaining employees the rot that had always been behind the impeccable facade. Neither of them remembered me anymore. Neither understood that it wasn't about them, but about what they had built at my expense. As they squabbled, the system deleted its traces, cleared records, collapsed contracts. The final code was like a mirror shattering with the image. And the company, which one day was born from a promise, now sank in silence. Because in the end, broken promises always exact their price. I watched everything from afar, from my laptop screen, with the sound off and my heart at peace. And while they fought, I watched everything from afar, free. Now, I'm curious about you who listen to my story. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Have you experienced something similar? Support the channel. Subscribe, like, comment, and share this video. I'm leaving another story on the final screen that you'll also enjoy, and it will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.